The story of the Exodus begins in the land of Egypt, where the Israelites, once a small family seeking refuge from famine, had now grown into a vast and distinct population. The memory of Joseph, the Israelite who had risen to prominence and saved Egypt from famine, had long since faded. In his place, a new pharaoh ascended to the throne, one who did not know Joseph, nor care for the contributions his people had made. As the Israelites continued to flourish in numbers, this new pharaoh's fear and paranoia grew. He saw them not as a people who had once brought prosperity, but as a potential threat to his power. His solution was swift and brutal: enslavement. The Israelites, once guests in the land, became forced laborers. They were subjected to backbreaking toil, building the monumental cities and structures of Egypt, their hands bound by chains, and their spirits weighed down by the oppression of a foreign ruler. This was the backdrop for one of the greatest stories of deliverance ever told, a moment in history when a people, bound by slavery, would rise through divine intervention and begin their journey toward freedom. This story unfolds against the backdrop of Egypt's immense power. During the New Kingdom period, around 1400 to 1200 BC, Egypt was at its zenith. It was a civilization of grandeur, with towering temples, sprawling cities, and a military that dominated the surrounding regions. Pharaohs ruled as divine monarchs, seen not just as kings but as living gods on earth, intermediaries between the people and the gods they worshipped. The religious world of Egypt was complex, with deities who governed every aspect of life. Ra, the sun god, was at the center of their worship, believed to travel across the sky each day, bringing light and life to the land. Osiris, the god of the underworld, promised the hope of life after death, while his wife, Isis, represented fertility and healing. These gods were woven into the very fabric of Egyptian life, from the grandest temple ceremonies to the simplest daily rituals. Egypt's economy was just as vast, driven by agriculture along the life-giving Nile River, which flooded annually, replenishing the soil and ensuring abundant harvests. But it was built on the backs of many who labored to support the empire's wealth, and among them, the Israelites suffered under the heavy yoke of Pharaoh's demands. The Israelite presence in Egypt began centuries earlier, during a time of famine when Joseph, an Israelite who had risen to power in Pharaoh's court, invited his family to settle in the fertile land of Goshen. Under Joseph's leadership, the Israelites thrived, growing in numbers and influence. But as the generations passed, the memory of Joseph's contributions faded, and the Israelites became foreigners in a land that once welcomed them. Pharaoh, consumed by fear and driven by a desire to maintain control, viewed the Israelites' growth as a threat to his kingdom. He feared that in the event of a war, the Israelites might ally with Egypt's enemies or attempt to rise against him. Thus, he decided to suppress them through forced labor, hoping that the harsh conditions would diminish their numbers and curb any thoughts of rebellion. The Israelites were put to work in Pharaoh's vast building projects, constructing cities like Pithom and Ramses. They labored under the hot sun, laying bricks and building monuments, their lives bound to the service of Egypt's insatiable desire for expansion and power. This was their reality, generation after generation born into slavery, with no hope of release. But amid this oppression, their cries for deliverance grew louder, and the stage was set for the rise of a deliverer. Into this world of oppression, a child was born who would change the course of history. Moses entered the world at a time when Pharaoh had decreed that every male Hebrew child should be killed at birth, a desperate attempt to curb the Israelite population. But Moses' mother, driven by love and faith, defied the king's orders. She hid her infant son for 3 months until it was no longer safe. In a final act of hope, she placed him in a basket made of reeds and set him afloat on the Nile, entrusting his fate to the currents of the river and, ultimately, to God. The basket drifted into the hands of none other than Pharaoh's daughter, who, moved by compassion, decided to raise the child as her own. And so, Moses grew up in the heart of Egypt's royal court, surrounded by the luxury and privilege of Pharaoh's household. But despite his upbringing, Moses never forgot his true identity. Though raised as an Egyptian prince, his Hebrew heritage was etched into his heart. As he grew older, the sight of his people's suffering weighed heavily on him, until one fateful day, he could no longer remain a passive observer. Moses' life took a dramatic turn when, in a moment of rage, he struck and killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave. Fearing retribution from Pharaoh, Moses fled into the wilderness, leaving behind the life he had known in Egypt. He sought refuge in the land of Midian, where he became a shepherd, living a quiet and humble life far from the grandeur of Pharaoh's court. During his time in Midian, Moses married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, a priest of Midian. He started a family and lived in relative obscurity, tending his flock and contemplating the years that had passed. It seemed as though Moses had been forgotten, a man who had once stood at the threshold of destiny, but was now resigned to a life of solitude. One day, as Moses was tending his flock near Mount Horeb, he encountered a sight that would change his life forever. A bush, engulfed in flames, yet not consumed, burned before him. As Moses approached, a voice called out from the fire, "Moses, Moses." It was the voice of God, calling him to a task that would seem impossible to any mortal man. God revealed his plan to Moses. He had heard the cries of his people in Egypt, and the time had come to deliver them. He commanded Moses to return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh. Moses, overwhelmed by the enormity of the task, protested. He doubted his ability, questioned his worthiness, and feared Pharaoh's wrath. But God reassured him, promising that he would be with Moses every step of the way. It was here, at the burning bush, that God revealed his name to Moses. "I am who I am." This name signified not just God's existence, but his eternal, unchanging nature. It was a name that would resonate through the ages, reminding the Israelites and the world of the power and presence of the God who was about to lead them out of bondage. Armed with the promise of God's presence and accompanied by his brother Aaron, Moses returned to Egypt, where he was greeted by the Israelite elders. Together, they presented God's message to Pharaoh: "Let my people go, that they may serve me." But Pharaoh, the living embodiment of Egypt's power, was not swayed by the words of two men. His heart was hardened, and in response, he increased the burden on the Israelite slaves, making their lives even more unbearable. Pharaoh's defiance set the stage for a series of confrontations between him and Moses, confrontations that would culminate in a series of divine judgments known as the 10 Plagues. The plagues that struck Egypt were no ordinary natural disasters. Each plague was a demonstration of God's power over the gods of Egypt, a direct challenge to their perceived authority. Over the course of months, Egypt was besieged by a series of calamities. First, their water turned to blood. The lifeblood of Egypt, the Nile River, was transformed into blood, killing fish and leaving the water undrinkable. The second was the frogs. Swarms of frogs emerged from the river, invading every home and field. The third plague was the gnats. Dust turned into gnats, covering people and animals alike. The fourth plague was flies. A plague of flies swarmed the land, bringing misery to the Egyptians. Fifth was the livestock pestilence. Disease struck the livestock of Egypt, killing many of their animals. The sixth was the boils. Painful boils afflicted the Egyptians, spreading across their bodies. 7. Hail. A storm of unprecedented ferocity rained down on Egypt, destroying crops and livestock. The eighth was the locusts. Swarms of locusts consumed every remaining crop, leaving Egypt barren. The ninth was darkness. A deep darkness fell over Egypt for 3 days. a darkness so thick it could be felt. The last one was the death of the firstborn. The final and most devastating plague took the lives of every firstborn in Egypt, from the palace of Pharaoh to the humblest slave, including the firstborn of their livestock. Each plague intensified in severity, yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Despite the destruction that ravaged his land, he refused to release the Israelites. It was only after the final plague, the death of his own firstborn, that Pharaoh relented, but not without deep bitterness and defiance. The 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn, was the most devastating of all. But before it unfolded, God gave Moses specific instructions for the Israelites. He commanded them to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, an innocent and unblemished animal sacrificed as a sign of protection. This act of faith would distinguish the Israelites from the Egyptians when the angel of death swept through the land that night. The meal they were to eat that evening, known as the Passover, was deeply symbolic. The lamb, roasted and eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, represented both the sacrifice and the haste with which they would soon flee from Egypt. The blood on the doorposts marked them as God's people, and the unleavened bread, made without yeast, was a reminder of the speed with which they would leave, with no time for the dough to rise. That night, as the angel of death moved through Egypt, the cries of the Egyptians filled the air. From the grand palaces to the poorest hovels, every household experienced the loss of their firstborn. Pharaoh's own son was among the dead, and in the face of such unparalleled grief, he finally relented. "Go," he commanded Moses. "Leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested." As dawn broke, the Israelites, over 600,000 men, along with women, children, and a vast multitude of livestock, gathered their belongings and began their journey. This was the moment they had prayed for, the fulfillment of the promise that had sustained them through generations of hardship. They left Egypt in haste, taking with them the spoils of their former masters, silver, gold, and clothing given to them as they departed. But the journey ahead was uncertain. Though they had escaped slavery, they now faced the daunting challenges of the wilderness, with the Red Sea before them and Egypt's vast desert behind. And, as they soon discovered, Pharaoh's change of heart was short-lived. As the Israelites made their way toward the Red Sea, Pharaoh's grief over his son's death began to turn to fury. He realized the implications of his decision. Egypt, without its enslaved labor force, would face an economic collapse. In a final act of defiance, Pharaoh summoned his chariots and soldiers, vowing to recapture the Israelites or destroy them. With his army of the finest charioteers and soldiers in pursuit, Pharaoh set off to intercept the fleeing Israelites. As they approached the Red Sea, the Israelites found themselves trapped, caught between the impassable waters before them and the rapidly advancing Egyptian forces behind them. Panic spread among the people, and they cried out to Moses, fearful that their freedom would be short-lived. It was in this moment of despair that God's power would once again be revealed in dramatic fashion. Moses, standing before the waters of the Red Sea, raised his staff as God commanded. A mighty wind began to blow, and before their eyes, the waters of the sea parted, creating a path of dry land through the midst of the sea. The Israelites, with their families and livestock, passed through the sea, their feet treading on dry ground while the walls of water towered on either side. As the last of the Israelites reached the other shore, Pharaoh's army arrived, charging headlong into the path that had been opened for them. But as they pursued, God commanded Moses to once again raise his staff. The waters, which had stood as a barrier to the Israelites' escape, came crashing down upon the Egyptians. Chariots and horses were swept away, and not one of Pharaoh's soldiers survived. The sea, which had seemed an impossible obstacle, became their deliverance. On the far shore, the Israelites watched as their oppressors were swallowed by the sea. Their freedom, purchased through divine intervention, was now undeniable. In a moment of triumph, they lifted their voices in song, praising God for his mighty deliverance. Having escaped Egypt, the Israelites now faced a new challenge: survival in the harsh wilderness. The journey to the Promised Land, which might have taken only a few weeks, stretched into 40 years as the people learned hard lessons of faith, dependence, and obedience. The wilderness was unforgiving. Water was scarce, and food was even more so. It wasn't long before the people began to grumble against Moses, asking if they had been led out of Egypt only to die of hunger and thirst in the desert. Their complaints reflected not just the physical hardship they faced, but also their wavering faith in the God who had delivered them. Yet time and again, God provided for their needs. When they were thirsty, he brought forth water from a rock. When they hungered, he sent manna, bread from heaven, that appeared on the ground each morning like dew. When they were tired of manna, he sent quail to satisfy their craving for meat. Despite their complaints, God remained faithful, sustaining them in ways that defied explanation. The most pivotal moment of the Israelites' wilderness journey came when they reached Mount Sinai. It was here, amid the thunder and lightning that enveloped the mountain, that God made a covenant with his people, a solemn agreement that would define their relationship with him for generations to come. Moses ascended the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments, a moral code that would form the foundation of Israelite society. These commandments were not merely laws, but a reflection of the holiness and justice of God. They covered the Israelites' relationship with God, such as worshiping no other gods, and their relationship with one another, such as prohibitions against murder, theft, and adultery. The giving of the law was a monumental moment in Israel's history. For the first time, they were not just a group of former slaves, but a nation with a covenant identity, chosen by God to be his people. This covenant came with both blessings and responsibilities, and it required the Israelites to live as a people set apart, following God's commands in all aspects of life. But even as Moses was receiving the law, the Israelites, camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, began to falter. In Moses' prolonged absence, they grew impatient and fearful. They turned to Aaron, Moses' brother, and demanded that he make them a god to lead them. Aaron, bowing to their pressure, fashioned a golden calf from their jewelry and declared it to be their god. This act of idolatry was a direct violation of the very first commandment they had just been given, to worship no other gods but the Lord. The people danced and celebrated around the golden calf, reveling in their rebellion against the God who had delivered them from Egypt. When Moses descended from the mountain and saw what the people had done, his anger burned hot. He threw down the stone tablets, breaking them in a dramatic symbol of the people's broken covenant with God. God's anger, too, was fierce, and he threatened to destroy the people for their disobedience. But Moses, in an act of intercession, pleaded with God to spare them, reminding him of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God relented, though a plague swept through the camp as punishment. Moses returned to the mountain to receive a second set of tablets, and the covenant was renewed. But the golden calf incident remained a stark reminder of the Israelites' tendency to turn away from God in moments of fear and uncertainty. After many years in the wilderness, the Israelites finally approached the borders of the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, which had been promised to Abraham and his descendants. But before entering, Moses sent 12 spies to scout the land and report back on its inhabitants and resources. The spies returned after 40 days, bringing with them samples of the land's bounty, including clusters of grapes so large that they had to be carried on poles. Their report confirmed what God had promised. Canaan was a land flowing with milk and honey. Yet, 10 of the spies focused on the formidable inhabitants they had seen, the Anakim, a race of giants who lived in fortified cities. They spread fear among the Israelites, claiming that it would be impossible to conquer such a land. Only 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, urged the people to trust in God. They reminded the Israelites that God had already delivered them from Egypt and would surely give them the strength to take the promised land. But the people were swayed by the negative report, and fear took hold. They rebelled against Moses, even suggesting that they return to Egypt rather than face the giants of Canaan. This rebellion angered God, who declared that because of their lack of faith, that generation would not enter the promised land. Only Joshua and Caleb, who had trusted in God's promise, would see the fulfillment of the covenant. The rest of the Israelites would wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies had spent scouting the land, until that faithless generation had passed away. As the years passed, the older generation gradually died out, and a new generation of Israelites grew up in the wilderness, knowing only the nomadic life. This generation, born in the desert, was free from the burdens of slavery that had weighed so heavily on their parents. They had seen God's provision in the wilderness, and they were prepared to enter the land with faith and determination. Moses, now an old man, continued to lead the people, though he himself would not enter the promised land. Because of an earlier act of disobedience, where he struck a rock in anger to bring forth water rather than speaking to it as God had commanded, Moses was denied the privilege of leading the people into Canaan. Yet, he remained their guide and teacher, preparing them for life in the land they were about to inherit. As the Israelites camped on the plains of Moab, overlooking the Jordan River and the land of Canaan, Moses gathered the people for one final address. He knew that his time was short, and he wanted to leave them with words of wisdom and encouragement. In what would become known as the Book of Deuteronomy, Moses recounted the journey of the Israelites, reminding them of God's faithfulness and urging them to obey the laws they had been given. Moses spoke of the blessings that would come with obedience to God's covenant, but he also warned of the curses that would follow if they turned away from him. His words were filled with both hope and caution, as he sought to prepare the Israelites for the challenges ahead. He then appointed Joshua as his successor, entrusting him with the leadership of the people. Joshua, who had shown courage and faith throughout the journey, was the one chosen by God to lead the Israelites into the promised land. After delivering his final address, Moses ascended Mount Nebo, where he gazed across the Jordan River to the land of Canaan. Though he would not enter it himself, he was given the privilege of seeing the land that had been promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob so many generations before. There, on the mountain, Moses died at the age of 120, and God himself buried him in an unknown grave. The people mourned the death of Moses, who had been their leader, prophet, and intercessor for so many years. Yet, even in their grief, they knew that the journey was not over. Under the leadership of Joshua, they would soon cross the Jordan and begin the conquest of Canaan, fulfilling the promise that had sustained them through centuries of slavery and decades of wandering. With Moses gone, Joshua took command of the Israelites, and God's promise to be with him, as he had been with Moses, was clear. Joshua led the people to the banks of the Jordan River, where once again a miraculous crossing awaited them. As the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the river, the waters parted, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground, just as they had done at the Red Sea. This crossing marked the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's history. They had finally arrived at the threshold of the Promised Land, and now they would begin the task of conquering it. The journey that had begun in Egypt was nearing its fulfillment, and the people, under Joshua's leadership, were ready to claim their inheritance. The sands of the Sinai had long since been washed from their feet, but the journey through the wilderness had left an indelible mark on the soul of the Israelite people. The Exodus was not merely a historical event. It became the crucible in which the identity of a nation was forged. With each retelling, with each Passover celebration, the story of deliverance from Egypt was woven more tightly into the fabric of Israelite consciousness. In the quiet evenings, as families gathered around flickering lamps, grandparents would recount to wide-eyed children the tales of the plagues that befell Egypt, of the sea that parted before their ancestors, of manna that fell from heaven. These were not just stories, but a living heritage, a reminder of who they were and where they had come from. The Exodus became the lens through which the Israelites viewed their relationship with God and their place in the world. They were a people set apart, chosen for a purpose, bound by a covenant sealed in the shadow of Mount Sinai. This sense of divine election would sustain them through centuries of trials, exiles, and persecutions, a flame of hope that refused to be extinguished. The events of the Exodus reverberated through the corridors of theological thought, shaping the very foundation of Israelite and later Jewish and Christian understanding of God. Here was a deity who intervened in history, who heard the cries of the oppressed and acted on their behalf. The God of the Exodus was not a distant, impersonal force, but a being who entered into relationship with his people, who made promises and kept them. The Ten Commandments, thundered from the heights of Sinai, became more than a set of rules. They were a blueprint for a just society, a radical reimagining of human relationships in light of divine law. The ethical monotheism that emerged from the Exodus experience would go on to shape the moral landscape of much of the world. In the centuries that followed, prophets would invoke the memory of the Exodus as they called the people back to faithfulness. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt," became a refrain, a reminder of both divine power and divine expectation. The Exodus was not just about freedom from. It was freedom for service, for justice, for the creation of a society that reflected the character of its liberator. The power of the Exodus narrative rippled far beyond the boundaries of Israel. It flowed into literature, art, and music, inspiring creators across cultures and centuries. The story of a people's journey from slavery to freedom resonated deeply with the human spirit, becoming a wellspring of artistic expression. In the plaintive notes of African American spirituals, the story of Moses leading his people to freedom found a new voice. Slaves in the American South saw their own struggles mirrored in the Israelites' plight and found hope in the promise of deliverance. "Go down, Moses," they sang, "way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." Artists throughout history have been captivated by the dramatic scenes of the Exodus. From Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel to the vivid canvases of Marc Chagall, the parting of the Red Sea, the giving of the law, and the worship of the golden calf have been rendered in countless styles and mediums. In literature, the themes of the Exodus have echoed through the ages. From Dante's Divine Comedy to Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, the motif of a journey towards freedom and a promised land has been a powerful narrative device. Even in modern cinema and television, the Exodus story continues to inspire, with adaptations and retellings that speak to new generations. As the sands of time have shifted, so too have the sands of Egypt and the Sinai, burying beneath them the footsteps of those who may have fled from Pharaoh's grasp. The quest to uncover tangible evidence of the Exodus has become a journey in itself, one that has led scholars and archaeologists on a winding path through desert wadis and ancient ruins. The silence of Egyptian records regarding the Exodus is deafening. No triumphant inscriptions boast of the Hebrews' subjugation. No laments bewail their departure. This absence of direct Egyptian testimony has fueled debate and speculation. Some see it as a calculated omission, an attempt by Egyptian scribes to erase a humiliating defeat from their annals. Others view it as evidence that the events, as described in the biblical narrative, may not have occurred on the grand scale portrayed. Yet, the sands occasionally yield tantalizing clues. The discovery of the Merneptah stele, dating to around 1208 BC, provides the earliest known reference to Israel outside of the Bible. This granite slab, while not mentioning the Exodus, confirms the presence of a people called Israel in Canaan at that time. It stands as a silent witness to the antiquity of the Israelite presence in the land promised to their forefathers. In the Delta region of Egypt, archaeologists have unearthed evidence of Semitic-speaking peoples living and working alongside Egyptians during the period traditionally associated with the Exodus. The remains of Avaris, believed by some to be the biblical Ramesses, tell a story of cultural intermingling and sudden abandonment. But whether these findings represent the Israelites of the Exodus narrative remains a subject of intense debate. The question of when the Exodus might have occurred has sparked countless scholarly discussions and disagreements. Two main theories have emerged, each with its proponents and detractors. The early date theory places the Exodus in the 15th century BC, during the reign of Thutmose III, or Amenhotep II. Supporters of this viewpoint to the biblical chronology, which suggests a period of about 480 years between the Exodus and the construction of Solomon's Temple. They argue that this timing aligns with evidence of destruction in Canaan that could be attributed to the Israelite conquest. The late date theory, on the other hand, situates the Exodus in the 13th century BC during the reign of Ramesses II or his immediate successors. This view finds support in archaeological evidence of widespread destruction in Canaan around 1200 BC, as well as in the mention of Israel on the Merneptah stele. Proponents argue that this later date better fits the archaeological profile of sites mentioned in the Exodus narrative. Each theory carries implications for our understanding of the event. The early date would place the Exodus during Egypt's period of imperial expansion, while the late date would set it against a backdrop of Egyptian decline and instability in the region. The Exodus story is one of the most powerful narratives in history, a tale of liberation, faith, and divine intervention. It is a story that has shaped the identity of the Jewish people for millennia and has resonated with countless others across cultures and generations. At its core, the Exodus is a story of God's faithfulness to his promises. From the moment he called Abraham and promised that his descendants would become a great nation, God's hand was at work, guiding the course of history to fulfill his covenant. The deliverance from Egypt, the giving of the law at Sinai, and the entrance into the promised land all testify to a God who is faithful to his word, even in the face of human weakness and failure. But the Exodus is also a story of human frailty, of fear, doubt, and rebellion. Time and again, the Israelites faltered, struggling to trust in their God who had delivered them. Yet, through it all, God remained patient and merciful, leading them through their wilderness experiences and preparing them for the life he had planned for them. The story of the Exodus is not just about a journey from one place to another. It is a story about becoming a people chosen, set apart, and sustained by the hand of their Hebrew God. The Exodus from Egypt was a dramatic turning point in Israel's history, marked by miraculous events that would be remembered for generations to come. The parting of the Red Sea, the pillar of fire, and the provision of manna in the desert, all these wonders testified to God's mighty power and his commitment to his people. In the end, Moses' story is one of obedience, trust, and surrender. He had to overcome his own doubts and fears to fulfill the mission God had given him. And in doing so, he became one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known. But to some it is just a story, and others a deeper truth lies beneath the surface, and maybe there's still more in store to discover about the story of Moses and the Exodus in Egypt.